Like many of you, I like to visit synagogues when I'm traveling, especially on Shabbat, for all the obvious reasons. One of the benefits of going on Shabbat is that you get to learn about the community and to meet people. Occasionally, I've even been invited to the homes of people I had previously not known. Now, I've never been to Norwich, England, but if I do ever get there, I will be sure to visit the synagogue. The only reason I even know that there's a Jewish community there is because an article about bones found at a construction site a few years ago caught my attention. Analysis of the skeletal remains revealed 17 individuals who were murdered in the 12th century, whose bodies had been unceremoniously dumped into a well. DNA testing indicated that the victims were all Ashkenazic Jews. There were 6 adults and 11 children, some as young as a few months old. The date of their deaths coincides with a well-documented and well-known anti-Semitic incident in February of 1190, when members of the Jewish community of Norwich were brutally tortured and murdered at the beginning of the Third Crusade. So when I learned of the discovery of Jewish victims in England, my thoughts turned to the book I recently read by Dara Horn, entitled People Love Dead Jews. She writes about the phenomena of places which once had thriving Jewish communities, but which are now Judenrein, devoid of any Jews, but which nevertheless sponsor tours to places of historic significance and interest to Jews. Personally, I appreciate the opportunity to visit and to learn about Jewish history and Jewish communities. But Horn has a somewhat cynical perspective and comments on what she refers to as an ingenious piece of marketing. She writes, quote, "There is a tourist industry concept popular in places largely devoid of Jews called, quote, Jewish heritage sites. The phrase sounds utterly benign, or to Jews perhaps even slightly dutiful, suggesting a place that you ought to visit. After all, you came all this way, so how could you not?" She says it's a much better name than property seized from dead or expelled Jews, to call it Jewish heritage sites. By calling these places Jewish heritage sites, all those pesky moral concerns, such as why these sites exist to begin with and whatever happened to the Jews who were there, all evaporate in a mist of goodwill, end quote. One place that she visited and she writes about is the city of Harbin in northeastern China, south of Siberia and north of North Korea, what we would call Jennisfeld. At one time, there were 20,000 Jews who lived there. And that's because in the late 1890s, Russia needed to develop a town for a railroad outpost. So they lured Jews with the promise of a region where they could live freely, devoid of anti-Semitic restrictions and the promise of no pogroms. Russian Jewish entrepreneurs took the bait and came and built the city's first banks, its hotels, its pharmacies, its department stores, and so on. They maintained a Jewish cemetery, a mikveh, schools, and even had a kosher butcher. The last Jewish family left there for Israel in 1962. The old synagogue is now a concert hall. The remnants of the once thriving Jewish community can be seen on a tour of Jewish cultural sites. Speaking of China, a fascinating book called The Last Kings of Shanghai, the rival Jewish dynasties that helped create modern China, chronicles the story of the Sassoon and Kadoorie families, both of whom came to the Far East from Baghdad, Iraq. Each in their own way built powerful economic powerhouses in Shanghai and Hong Kong in the 19th century that flourished and dominated aspects of the Chinese economy and made major contributions to its development. The Sassoon family grew to become one of the mightiest and wealthiest business dynasties in all of Asia, and the financial empire that the Kadoories built was not far behind. Eventually, with the rise of communism, their brand of capitalism fell in disfavor, and their assets were seized and nationalized. Consistent with the thesis of Horn's book, All that remains today of the once mighty Sassoon and Kadoorie kingdoms in Shanghai are artifacts, scattered historical plaques, a few portraits in one of their fabled hotels, and the Shanghai Jewish Refugees Museum, all of which can be taken in a walking tour of the former Jewish ghetto. But to me, the most fascinating aspect of the story is when the two competing families set aside their differences and cooperated during World War II to help to save and rescue Jews fleeing Nazi Germany. Despite being ruthless, competitive, and aggressive in business, both families acted magnanimously and unselfishly to care and provide for refugees escaping Nazi Germany and Austria who were coming to Shanghai because it was one of the few places in the entire world which didn't require a visa in order to enter. At considerable personal expense, the Sassoons and Kadoories provided food, shelter, clothing, education, and job training for the 18,000 Jews who fled to China. They not only gave the Jewish refugees meals, they helped them find jobs, and they used their influence to shield them from a unit of the SS which had been dispatched from Berlin specifically to exterminate the Jewish residents in Shanghai. They prevailed upon Chinese politicians to help, and upon Madame Sun Yat-sen to lead a delegation to the German consulate to protest Germany's anti-Jewish policies. So why did these Iraqi Jews, living in the lap of luxury in China, with no familial connection to the refugees coming from Europe, go to such lengths to rescue and to help them? There is one reason to explain their feelings and their actions. It's the same reason that when Peter Stuyvesant wrote in September of 1654 to the directors of the Dutch West India Company requesting permission to evict the 24 Jews who had recently arrived on a boat from Recife, Brazil, and whom he had incarcerated, the message he got back from the board of directors was, well, to paraphrase the immortal words of Mel Brooks in Blazing Saddles, "Los them gain." Let them go, meaning release them from prison and let them stay in America. And they became the first Jewish community in what was to become the United States. Stuyvesant wrote to his employer that the Jews who had just landed in New Amsterdam were, quote, very repugnant to the inferior magistrates, and described them as, quote, hateful enemies and blasphemers of the name of Christ, who should not be allowed to settle in New Amsterdam. Now, what the anti-Semitic governor probably did not realize was that many, if not most, of the investors in the Dutch West India Company and a number, if not the majority, of the people who sat on its board of directors were all Jews. They weren't too happy with the letter. But the question is, why would Jews sitting in Amsterdam care about the fate of people halfway across the world? People they didn't know and who were described in derogatory terms as vagrants? It's the same reason that the Sassoons and the Kadoories did what they did. Whether these Jews were familiar with the Talmudic dictum or not, Kol Yisrael arevin zeh lazeh, which I like to translate, all Jews have a responsibility to each other and for each other, we don't know. But what is certain is that they lived by that principle, and that it guided their decisions and their actions. Although separated by continents and centuries, in both instances, they actively understood what Jews have known ever since we stood at Mount Sinai, ever since we became a people bound to God, Torah, and each other by an eternal covenant. I think I first learned and imbibed this concept from my grandmother of blessed memory. I used to read selections to her when I was in college, translated from the original Yiddish from the Bintel Brief. The Bintel Brief was the precursor to Dear Abby, Ann Landers, and other modern advice columns. Written by Abe Kahan, the editor of the Jewish Forward, the Yiddish paper was the most widely circulated newspaper in America at the time, and that was the most popular feature in the paper. And so when I would read to my grandmother the agonizing and difficult personal challenges and family problems encountered by the Greenhorns, the new immigrants who came to America in the early 1900s, she would get upset. She would worry about them, and I would have to remind her and reassure her and say, Grandma, you don't need to worry about these people. These things all happened over 70 years ago. They're all dead. But she identified personally with them. Their joy was her joy. Their suffering and problems were her problems. She truly felt their pain. They were her people. It was as if they were mishpacha, family. And in a way, they were. That is one of the reasons we take an interest in places where Jews once lived. We want to find out about our mishpacha, our family. The sense of peoplehood and connection that we have is one of our defining characteristics, and it is often what drives and motivates some of our altruistic acts. It explains why Israel, ever since its founding, has gone to such great lengths and expense to clandestinely rescue Jews from distant lands, sometimes at great cost and great risk, whether it's from Arab countries, the countries that constituted the former Soviet Union, and as recently as just this past month, from Ethiopia, Ukraine, and Russia. There are times when Israel even negotiated a ceasefire between two warring sides in order to allow the airlift of Jews out of a war zone in order to safely bring them to Eretz Yisrael, to the land of Israel, to be reunited with their people. At a wedding celebration earlier this summer, Natan Sharansky, former Soviet prisoner of conscience, leader of the Soviet Jewry movement, Israeli minister, and former head of the Jewish Agency, spoke at a Sheva Brachot celebration of the wedding of Benaya Dickstein, whose parents were both murdered by Arab terrorists when he was 7 years old, about 20 years ago. Sharansky told the assembled guests that when he was growing up in Donetsk, Ukraine, everyone had identity papers that indicated what their nationality was. It didn't matter what nationality was on the papers, unless it said you were a Jew. And then, he said, it was as if you had some kind of a disease. He said, quote, "We Soviet Jews knew nothing about what it meant to be Jewish, other than the anti-Semitism we experienced, the hatred, the discriminatory treatment because of it. And when it came to a university application, no one ever tried to change his designation from Russian to Ukrainian, and certainly not to Jewish. But they did try to change it from Russian to Ukrainian because it didn't matter. But if you could change your designation from being labeled as a Jew to something else, it substantially improved your chances of being admitted to a university." And then he said, during the summer, "This week I saw thousands of people standing day and night at the borders of Ukraine, trying to escape. And the only word on their identity papers that could help them get out was the word Jew. Because if you are a Jew today, there are Jews outside who care about you and who are waiting for you. There is someone on the other side of the border who is searching for you." And he concluded, "When I was a child, no one ever envied us. But today, on the Ukrainian border, identifying as a Jew describes those who have a place to go, where their family, an entire nation, is waiting for them." This is what it means to be a Jew in the 21st century, to be a part of a people who have a homeland, a nation founded upon the principle stated in its Declaration of Independence that it is, quote, "the natural right of the Jewish people to be masters of their own fate, like all other nations." The Declaration further states that the land of Israel is where our spiritual, religious, and political identity was shaped, which is why Zionism and Israel are essential and integral elements of Jewish identity. Which brings me to the problem with those who are anti-Zionists and non-Zionists, those who deny or oppose the existence of the State of Israel. In so doing, they reject the notion that we are a people. What they're actually saying, if you think about it, whether they realize it or not, what they're saying is that Judaism is just a religion, not a people. Not only are they blatantly mistaken, they have no right to define who we are. The most recent example of all too many comes from the University of California at Berkeley School of Law. Prodded to act by an anti-Israel, pro-Palestinian hate group, 9 student groups adopted a bylaw prohibiting any pro-Israel speakers at any of their events. In response to the action, civil rights attorney Kenneth Marcus wrote, quote, like other forms of Judeophobia, anti-Zionism is an ideology of hate, treating Israel as the collective Jew and smearing the Jewish state with defamations similar to those used for centuries to vilify individual Jews. He points out that substituting the word Zionist for Jew is a convenient euphemism and an attempt to cover their anti-Semitism. Ruth Weiss has written, the worst anti-Semitic attacks in America are happening these days on campuses during Apartheid Week, subsidized by university administrations on the grounds that they are a form of self-expression. Such events may kill fewer Jews now, but blaming Israel consolidates and promotes the malicious inversion that holds Jews responsible for aggression against them. Excluding students from participating in various groups and making the cost of admission for Jews' opposition to the Jewish state, as has happened on other campuses throughout the country, is not protected free speech. There's a word to describe what this is. That word is discrimination. And it is repugnant, offensive, immoral, and illegal. Hostility to Jews and Israel is rampant on college campuses across the country. We must be vigilant because this ugly hatred on camp can seep and spill over into other parts of our society and body politic, as it did in the Labour Party under Corbyn in England and is beginning to happen even here. The time has come, my friends, for us to be more assertive with those who deny us our rights to free expression, with those who seek to undermine support for Israel, those who intimidate and attempt to silence its supporters or exclude them from certain activities. It's time to make it clear this is not acceptable, for they are in fact violating our civil rights. So any parent who is here, who is sending their child to a college has a right to demand, considering the amount of money you're paying for that your child not be harassed and not be subjected to hateful anti-Semitic actions masquerading under the thin veneer of anti-Zionism. And any adult here who is a graduate of a college where this happens must express your concern to your alma mater if things are allowed to be said or done about Jews in support of Israel, which are not tolerated when done to any other minority. We must stand up for our rights. The irony is that the concentrated, concerted effort to portray Israel as a pariah nation is so very different from the reality of what Israel actually is. It is always the first to mobilize and send aid when disaster strikes anywhere in the world. When I was in Israel this past summer, I witnessed firsthand its ethnic diversity and tolerance more than ever before. And I couldn't help but think about the absurdity of the attempt to label the country as practicing apartheid. Perhaps since I spent most of my time not in one of the major cities, which is where I usually go, I heard all kinds of languages and was attuned to the diversity and inclusiveness of Israeli society. I saw it in shopping centers where Arabs and Jews of all kinds worked and shopped side by side without any discrimination or distinction. I saw it at the gym that I joined, which had Jews from Russia working out alongside Jews from Ethiopia and Israeli Arabs. And I couldn't help but wonder why it is that there's so little tension between the various Jewish ethnic groups. People from different countries of origin, like Poland, getting along with people from Yemen or other Arab countries. How to explain and understand this phenomena, which after all is not found in most other countries where people of different ethnic backgrounds and origins often clash and fight and do not get along. Now, I'm not saying that there aren't any problems and that there aren't snide comments and jokes told by one group stereotyping another, but relatively speaking, Israel is much less in Israel than in most mixed societies, including our own here in America. So how to explain that? Well, being surrounded by enemies who want to destroy you can help. It can help to unite people and bring them together. But even more than that, or perhaps related to it, is the recognition that wherever we are, wherever we have lived, we share a common fate and destiny. Despite being spread out across the globe throughout the centuries, we have had similar experiences, and we've been exposed to similar forms of hatred. Which brings me back to the point I stated at the outset. We are a people, and we have an obligation to stand up and help and support each other. This point may seem obvious to all of us who are here today, and it pains me to say this, but my friends, unfortunately, there are Jews, even some with the title rabbi, and would-be rabbis, who do not understand or accept or appreciate this basic fact. They do not recognize that Zionism is the fulfillment of 2,000 years of longing and is the most important enterprise of the Jewish people in our time. Having a connection to the people, the land, and the state of Israel is an integral part of Jewish identity, of what it means to be a Jew. National Rabbinic Organization, which I founded, the Zionist Rabbinic Coalition, has responded to those who deny that we have a connection or responsibility to each other and to the well-being of the Jewish state by calling on rabbinic seminaries not to accept individuals as candidates for the rabbinate who do not subscribe to this belief. Recognizing that Jews have a wide range of opinions on Israeli policy, and as we wrote, the criticism of Israel, including on the topic of Israel's treatment of Palestinians, is legitimate and necessary. But nevertheless, we make a distinction between legitimate criticism and outright opposition to the Jewish state. We pointed out the long-term danger of ordaining rabbis who harbor anti-Zionist views, for it contributes to the distancing of Jews, not just from Israel, but from the Jewish people and from Judaism. We concluded that, quote, those who lack Ahavat Yisrael, of which anti-Semitism is a manifestation, cross a line and should not be allowed to be leaders of the Jewish people. And I regret to inform you that here in Montgomery County, where over 80% of religiously biased hate crimes are committed against Jews, there are rabbis who, like the Council of American Islamic Relations, oppose the efforts of the American Jewish Committee and our local Jewish Community Relations Council to adopt the widely accepted definition of anti-Semitism, known as IRA, the International Holocaust Resolution on Anti-Semitism, for fear that it would limit legitimate criticism of Israel. As I wrote in an email to my colleagues, quote, the last thing we Jews need to worry about is that there isn't enough criticism of Israel. Our sacred text and sages teach us, Im ein ani li mili, if I am not for myself, who will be for us? Our history has shown, and our enemies have shown and proven throughout the ages and have reminded us, regardless of the nature or extent of our religious practice or our beliefs, we are a people with a common shared fate and destiny. The opening story in Yafa Eliach's beautiful Hasidic tales of the Holocaust is told by the Grand Rabbi of Bloslov, Rabbi Israel Spira, of a dark, cold night in the Janauska concentration camp in Ukraine, when suddenly a centurion shout pierced the air and told all of the inmates, you are all to evacuate the barracks immediately and report to the vacant lot. Anyone remaining inside will be shot on the spot. And so the SS soldiers ordered the Jews to march. Many died along the way as they were marching. And when they came to a large pit, the sadistic soldiers ordered the prisoners to jump over it. Those who fell in and didn't make it to the other side would be shot. The saintly, pious Rabbi Spira had befriended a freethinker, a secular Jew, who did not believe in God or Judaism. And when they got to the edge of the pit, the young man told the rabbi, there really is no point in even trying to jump. We are so weak and malnourished, he said. But the rabbi encouraged him and insisted they must try and they must have hope. Although the pit was filled with bodies that didn't make it, the two of them closed their eyes. They jumped, and much to their surprise, somehow they both miraculously found themselves standing on the other side of the pit. The man was incredulous. He hugged the rabbi and exclaimed, we are alive, we are alive. Maybe there is a God after all. And then he turned and he asked the elderly, frail rabbi how he managed to do the impossible, how he could jump over this enormous pit and land safely on the other side without falling to his death. And the rabbi explained and said, when I jumped, I held on to Zechus Avos, the merit of my ancestors, the coattails of my father and my mother, of my grandfathers and my grandmothers of blessed memory, and all of the mitzvot they had performed in their lives. And the rabbi then turned and asked his companion, the non-religious secular Jew who didn't believe in God, whom he had befriended. He said to him, what about you? How did you reach the other side of the pit? What were you holding on to? And the young man said, Rabbi, I was holding on to you. One held on to tradition, the mitzvot, the heritage of our ancestors. The other held on to his fellow Jew, and together they survived. The point is, we need to hold each other. We need each other. Dara Horn feels that the interest in dead Jews is misplaced. She would prefer if there were greater interest in Jews who are alive and in Jewish life. She points out that most people have no trouble naming 3 death camps where Jews died during the Holocaust, but have difficulty naming 3 Yiddish authors. As she writes, quote, thousands of Holocaust books and movies and TV shows and lectures and courses and museums and mandatory school curricula attest to the popularity of dead Jews. But she questions how effective such efforts and expenditures are, as they haven't led to a reduction in Jew hatred or violent acts against Jews. In 1983, Ofra Chaza represented Israel and performed the song entitled Chai at the annual Eurovision Song Contest in Germany, where the song took second place. Singing in Munich, Germany in 1983, less than 40 years after the Holocaust and 9 years after the massacre of Israeli Olympic athletes by Palestinian terrorists in Munich, the song had special meaning and significance. It was a proud expression of defiance. The symbolism was subtle, but powerful. Poignantly and not unintentionally, their costumes were yellow in order to evoke and remind those who were watching of the yellow stars Jews were forced to wear during the Holocaust. And appearing on the stage with the singer were 5 other singer-dancers, 6 Israelis performing on a stage in Germany, also a number which clearly was not coincidental. And the song's refrain boldly proclaims, Zeh hashir shel Abba, Shar, Zeh hashir shel Saba, Shar etmol la'Abba. This is the song which my grandfather sang yesterday to my father. V'hayom ani. And now today, I sing it. Chai, chai, chai. Od avinu chai. I am still alive. Am Yisrael chai. The people of Israel lives. Yes, lamrot hakol, despite everything, we are alive. We must reject the path of those who seek to divide and distance us from our fellow Jews and from the Jewish state. Instead, let us do what we have always done, what Jews have done throughout the ages: hold on to and embrace and support each other, like the rabbi and his friend, like the Sassoons and the Kadoris, like the Jews in Amsterdam, and so many countless other times elsewhere throughout the ages. This is the essence of what it means to be a Jew. And so let us preserve and keep alive the song of our people, the song that is both ancient and modern, that celebrates our past and the vitality of our present and of our future, the song of Judaism. And to do so, we have to learn the melody and the words, the rich and beautiful heritage bequeathed to us, so we can pass it on to the next generation. For as its refrain proclaims, the Hayom Ani, today me. But what it really means is, now the song is ours. The song of our ancestors, the song of our parents, the song of our grandparents is now our song. Let us proudly sing it, and let us say amen.